Okay, so as Britton said, I'm Ellis Mumford Russell, and then my partner Anne McGlone here with Post Oak Preservation Solutions. And we've been working with the city of Georgetown to update the design guidelines, as I'm sure you're aware of at this point. And so what we'll do today is I'm just going to introduce you to what we've done so far, and Anne will take us through a draft of the guidelines so you can get an introduction to what is inside of the guidelines. So we'll get started through that. So about us, Post Oak is a full service preservation consulting firm. We have offices in Austin and San Antonio. We have expertise in design standards, design guidelines, like what we're doing in Georgetown, but we also work with historic tax credits and general preservation consulting. We have successfully completed design guidelines across the country, including in Junius Heights, Munger Place, and Lake Cliff Park in Dallas, Oread and Mission Hills in Kansas, and North Platte and Chadron in Nebraska. So a pretty diverse portfolio of similar projects. For Georgetown, we've been tasked with drafting design guidelines for both downtown and Old Town. And these will provide clarity and sort of a shared understanding as to what is appropriate and not appropriate in these two overlay areas. The design guidelines strive to provide a consistent decision-making process, but for HARC, for property owners, and for the city of Georgetown. And to get you up to speed on where we are at timing-wise, we started this work in October with field work. Anne and I came up to Georgetown, spent a lot of time photographing, driving around, talking with city staff. In November, we began analyzing the existing conditions in Georgetown. And then in December, if you were at our public meeting then, you would have heard us present what our findings were. What is the existing condition in Georgetown? What are some of the issues that we're facing that we need to be sure to address in the guidelines? Since December, we've been working to develop the new design guidelines, which are really more of a refresh of the existing ones to make them clearer and more user-friendly. And then right now here in April, we are presenting a second draft. The first draft went to city staff. This is our public draft presented to you all for review and comment. This timeline says complete in May. We'll be complete in June, working with city to make those final revisions. And then I'll go ahead and let Anne go ahead and take us from here, describing what our guidelines are going to do, and then some of the specific changes we're proposing in this second draft.
Thank you, Ellis. I just always like to remind people what design guidelines are and what they don't do. So they are a tool for decision making. They're really there so that we're all speaking from the same page. And hopefully the guidelines are clear enough that owners could read them and understand what HARC wants, that staff can use them as an educational tool to explain to people about what's important in the historic districts. And it's also a tool to promote the history of Georgetown through its history and through its architecture, and to help the general public understand what makes Georgetown so special, and its architecture and its culture. What design guidelines don't do is that they don't control use. They're a design overlay, and the use of the property is by zoning. They don't stop change. The historic districts have changed over time. They'll continue to change. What the guidelines do is to help the city manage that change. Guidelines also don't anticipate every situation that's going to come up. We hope these guidelines are in place for about 10 to 15 years is about a good length of time for guidelines before they need to be relooked at. But we have tried to, with our experience in other historic districts, anticipate some of the things, and I think you'll see that in our guidelines. So I'm going to walk through them with you. We have we have redone them. And not the words so much, but one of the things we wanted to do was make them clear, make them more user-friendly, so people didn't have to keep flipping back and forth. So we have a new cover, we have new images that we use Georgetown as examples. We heard from you early that, you know, the examples from weren't local examples, and so we've really tried to use Georgetown as illustrating our ideas. And it's a new document style. So you'll see on our next slide that we have reduced the chapters from 14 to 5. Basically, chapter 1 deals with the downtown area, that 9 square block around the courthouse. Chapter 2 deals with area 2, which is the rest of the downtown district. That's the sort of transition area into Old Town. And then chapter 3 is about Old Town. The 4th chapter is about demolitions. The 5th chapter is about signage. What we've done is before chapter 1, we've put a lot of preface material that some people might want to skip, and some people will want to read the whole thing. But if you were doing a project in downtown, we are trying to make it very clear that you would just go to chapter 1 and everything you would find in there. Background information would be in the preface. And then we have an appendix that has some sort of maintenance information in there and some basic things. So we've removed all the duplicated things that were in the previous design guidelines, but we've kept the essence of what's there. I mean, it'll look familiar to you. And I've just explained, we've sort of simplified that navigation through the guidelines, and the content has moved from chapter intros to the numbered design guidelines where needed. So on the next slide, I was trying to illustrate that we have actually numbered everything in a very sort of systematic way, so that when people are looking for specific guidelines, they're easier to find, and you don't have to read the entire text to get to the part that you're looking for. It also will simplify it for staff. We've organized the guidelines basically in chapters 1, 2, and 3 into 3 ways. And I think we talked about this when we described character of the area. We're going to talk about the public realm first, the sort of big picture of how the property addresses the rest of the historic district. Then we're going to look at the site design, what's happening on that particular lot, how a building faces the street, where it's located, where extra accessory place buildings are located. And then we're going to look at the building design itself. We really believe that a lot of times historic drives right into the building design, when in fact it's something.
I think we lost Anne for a second, so I'll pick up where she was while she gets reconnected. But Anne was saying that oftentimes, oh, you're back, Anne.
Oh,
all right, pick it up. We lost you when you were going into the order of when you talk about building design.
Oh, that that they're organized in the way of chapters, so that in each chapter it's organized by public realm, site design, and building design format. So we talk about how the building sits in the whole historic district, how it fits, how buildings fit within the lot, in the site design, and then we speak about the building itself. I think I'm ready for the next slide. Yeah, so we start out in the preface with how to use the guidelines. You open up the book, you get past the title and the table of contents, how to use these things, what preservation principles are, how to organize your project, what's the strategy for getting successfully through the HARC process, and then we have a history of Georgetown. We follow that with chapter 1. So chapter 1 is about the downtown district, and it's area 1 in the downtown district. So that's that 9 square area. We organize it by saying, here's what the design goals are. Then we talk about the existing character of the existing district. We talk about public realm issues. We talk about how buildings are on the site. We talk about the buildings themselves, and then we talk about the style. And then, which was from your old, a lot of that is directly from your the existing ordinance. Then we talk about retaining and preserving. What do you do with a historic building that you already own? How to preserve what you already have. So that is the main structure. So we have the design goals. I think you can flip through these pretty fast, Ellis. The design goals, the existing character, the retaining and preserving. And then we talk about the under retain and preserving, we also talk about exterior materials. That was one thing that council specifically asked for, was what about exterior materials and substitute materials. So we say what's acceptable, but we also, because we think it's very helpful to say these things are not acceptable. You can't use them in the downtown area. So we organize it that way when you're going through. We also talk about the public realm. So we're going to talk about streets and parking, canopies and awnings, lighting, street furniture, sidewalks, public art, all of those things that when somebody comes to downtown Georgetown, it's the first thing that they see. And we're going to make sure all of that is right. We haven't changed very much of any of that that's in the existing guidelines. That's going to be fairly similar to what you have. I think we really define the difference between canopies and awnings, but for the most part, it should seem very familiar to you. Then we move on to site design, and we talk about setbacks, the front line, the buildings touching up to the front line of the property, lot coverage, what we do on corner buildings, and what the primary facade is and how you treat that. So that language is also pretty much from the old, I keep saying old now, the existing guidelines. So that should all be very familiar. It's just got new names and new numbers. We talk about new construction. We've tried to give you a few more illustrations. We talk about mass and form. We talk about base, middle, cap, and how important that is. We talk about height and width. Again, we'll talk about exterior materials, substitute materials. Windows, we have some very specific language in there about how they set in the facade of the building and how far back they set to cast shadows. So it looks more like a historic building. We talk about storefronts, additions and where appropriate additions. And then we talk about mechanical equipment, where all that stuff goes, how you paint it is all part of that. We then move on to area 2, and we talk about, again, design goals, the existing character, and how to retain and preserve. So if somebody's in area 2, not area 1, they would just go to this chapter, and so they can read it all here. They don't have to flip through the book. So in area 2 is probably where we made the biggest difference between the existing ordinances. When we talked about existing character, we noticed a few things. We did know that there had been some issues about how you make a building fit in this transition zone between what's basically a residential area and a commercial area. It gets really complicated, and we've tried to simplify that for you. So when we looked at existing character, we're using Rock Street as an example. This is looking north. And you see that there's buildings that are right up to the property line. It has an urban feel to it, as opposed to a residential feel. If we turn around on the next slide and look south, you know at this point that you're in an urban area, an urban place in downtown. But if you go further down Rock Street, still within area 2, we get into what is obviously a residential district. And so we have decided that those are character defining features, or character define, it helps define the character of area 2.
All right, I'll pick up till Anne gets back on. But essentially oh, you're back, Anne. Every time I try to pick up for you, you come right back on. Okay. Go ahead.
All right, I'm sorry. So where did I leave off? I'm sorry that my internet is.
We were just saying this is character defining, this transition area.
This trend. So let's just look at the next slide. I think that'll be good. So we have defined two character areas, the urban commercial and the urban residential. And those are just in area 2 of the downtown ordinance. And we have actually set up guidelines that differ between those two character defining areas. And we've even gone a step further, and we have outlined on maps, and this is something you all might want to carefully look at, our 3 maps, which will be a separate attachment, or actually, I think I think Britton's going to put them in the document, that we have outlined what we think are residential character block faces and what we think are urban character block faces. And the guidelines between the two are different. The main thing is the setbacks, and I think we can move on to the next slide. So you've done some new urban commercial buildings. You've changed materials. The existing ordinance guidelines say you should change them every 30 feet. On closer examination of the buildings, we've changed that to every 50 feet. There should be, to keep that rhythm of downtown going. And on the next slide was a 2-story version that you also approved. And I know that you worked really hard on this one, but these are urban buildings, and I just sort of, this would be the sort of character of urban buildings that's described in the guidelines. And the building descriptions of those are really close to what would happen in the downtown area 1. But the urban residential, we have become more specific about using traditional house forms in the urban residential areas. So you get pitched roofs. You get materials that are much more associated with a residential structure. The sort of scale and size of the building would be much more residential. Now, these are 2 small residential commercial buildings. So, they were probably residential at first, but now they're commercial. They have pitched roofs, they have simple shapes, they have larger windows.
All right, I'll pick up, and then she's going to get right back on the moment I start talking. But essentially that, oh, and now you're back again, Anne.
But go ahead, Ellis. Okay. I don't know what's going on.
And so these buildings, so the previous example was showing ones that likely were houses that then became a commercial use. But in the example here, we're seeing a decidedly commercial building, but that uses some of the residential form that we've been talking about, the gabled roof, the types of materials and scale, and then importantly, setback that we would associate with a more residential type property. So this could work in those transition areas in area 2. And then here's another example from San Antonio, similar. So it's clearly a commercial building, but it is in context with the residential surroundings, with the pitched roof and materials and scale that makes sense in this sort of transitional commercial residential area. And again, this has a setback too, so meaning it's not built right up to the street. And one of our key hopes with the urban residential design is that we get to maintain the residential character in setback and have parking move towards the rear so that it still feels mostly like a residential property. And so here are some examples of different size lots where we've basically done the math to see that you can fit a commercial building, a new construction, with the urban residential setback that we were suggesting and parking in the rear. Again, so that from the front, from the street and from that pedestrian experience, it is retaining that residential compatibility. Do you have more to add to that, Anne?
No, that's excellent.
Okay.
I'm gonna, so I will continue until you can't hear me again, if that's okay. So in chapter 3, we talk about Old Town, and that's primarily residential. There's a little commercial in there that we address, but it's the same format again, that we talk about the design goals of the district, what the existing character is, and retain and preserve. I wanted to point out in the next slide that one thing that we've done is, and that styles, is we have tried to identify every major style of house in Georgetown. And we've really given you a little bit of history about it. We've talked about the main style characteristics of it, what the materials are. Here are the things that are important. And we do that for every house so that as people add on, they know what's important and what needs to be retained. So I think that'll be really useful. And then we talk about the public realm. In Old Town, we talk about public to private. And so these are private front yards, but when you go down the street, you walk down the sidewalk, they have a sense of being part of the public. And so we talk about what that looks like and feels like. We talk about sidewalks, the parkways between the sidewalk and the street. We talk a little about front yard landscaping. We don't get into whether you're planting petunias or zinnias, but major things that might influence it, like fences and what fences ought to look like, mailboxes in multi-tenant buildings, mechanical and where your mechanical systems might be seen from the street. And then we also talk about porches, because porches are that transition area between the public to the private. And those become really important. And most houses have big porches in them. And we think that's an important to continue that in the neighborhood. When we talk about site design, we talk about the primary entrances. We actually say you have to see a front door. It has to face the street. You need to know when you look at the house where the front door is. We talk about relationship to neighbors, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in the next slide. We talk about the location of garages and carports, and parking and driveways. One of the things we've added in that whole sort of relationship to neighbors and how you work with your neighbor is what we call looming standards. And I'll use this backyard as an example. This was somebody's private backyard, and the next door neighbor in the blue house has a huge addition that went almost the entire length of their backyard with large windows that looked out on it. This is in another historic district, and it causes consternation between neighbors. And so we've actually sort of addressed, if you're going to build your addition on the property line, it extends past your neighbor's house, the sill heights have to be up, and we try to control that looming ordinance. You can have windows, you just have to have them into your own backyard, not into somebody else's backyard. So that is a brand new thing. And then we talk about building design. We talk about massing, form, and scale. We try to define those a little better than they are defined right now, so that everybody knows what we're talking about. We talk about the simple forms of the historic houses, that they're rectangles or L's or T's generally. They have very simple roofs on them. And we give you illustrations of what we mean by that. And then we also sort of throughout the document give you illustrations of what is not appropriate, because we have found as we've administered guidelines, you know, basically doing what Britain's doing, that when we try to talk to somebody about design guidelines, sometimes it's easier just for them to see the no picture than the yes picture. And so we do have a few no pictures, like, you know, this is a house of many gables. It has a very complex shape to it, and it would not be appropriate in the district. We've also done something that is not quite finished yet in this draft, but we're actually taking every style and showing where it's appropriate to add on and how to add on. And we've also shown some illustrations where you shouldn't just continue the roof up on it, and then we, you know, show that that's not a proper thing to do. We're using really sort of simple models, and we'll show you each one of those by style, which I think will be really helpful for how to add on, what's the appropriate way to add on to each building, each different kind of style of building. So then chapter 4 is about demolitions. We've had a hard time knowing how to graphically show demolitions, because we don't want to put a house up there and people are going, what? You think that could be demolished? So I've chosen for this presentation to just show you a vacant lot. So your existing ordinance says no demolitions unless there's a public hazard by the building inspector. We've added a little bit to that, and we've said that the public official has to meet with your historic preservation officer to see if there is any possible way to save the building, or if there could be a repair made that would make the building not hazardous anymore, instead of just blanket allowing it to come down. There might be some, if there's any finances available to help the owner, if there's or other things that the historic preservation officer might be able to do to save the building. The other thing, if it's a benefit to the community, your ordinance says that it's okay to demolish it. I didn't touch that one. Just left that one like it is. But you also had one about undue financial hardship. And that was pretty undescribed in your existing ordinance. So we have actually laid out some things that an owner would have to show, specific sort of a list of things to show that there's financial hardship. We've also have a clause in there about low income folks and how to take that into consideration also. And the other thing you asked us to look at, I believe, was a better definition of loss of integrity or loss of significance, that the building has lost its integrity and significance. So we have added that also. Our 5th chapter deals with signage. So we have, we start out with the types of signage as primary and secondary. So everybody gets 1 primary and 2 secondary signs, and we talk about the different kinds of signs that you may have. And we talk about the number that you're allowed and the size that you're allowed. And then we describe flush mounted signs, canopy signs, the regulations for all of these, window signs, temporary signs, projecting signs, under canopy signs. I'm not sure I listed them all on this, but they're all there. And then we talk about the sign design itself, like much more technical about what it can be made of, how it can be lit, how it can be attached to a building. And then finally, we talk about multi-tenant signs. So if there's a building that has multi-tenants in it, how do you decide what everybody gets? And then finally, I can't see it because we actually have a list of prohibited signs. And so you might want to look that over and make sure that we haven't gone overboard. But basically, we took signs that you say are unacceptable or not acceptable in your ordinance, and we just put them in a thing so that it was very clear that these are prohibited signs. My favorite one that we put in there was, you may not have giant blow up animals that are attached to the roof of your building. So we did say that. I think it's you might want those, but I didn't think that was a very good idea, so we took those out. And then finally, we have an appendix, which I hope you find very helpful. We have a glossary of all the terms. You had that in your old ordinance or the existing ordinance. And but we also have added a historic material maintenance. So how do you take care of these historic materials? And we have a whole section on that for you if you want to how to take care of your building. And then we've also included the Secretary of Interior's standards. So that's it from the preface to the appendix. We hope that you read it. The words are all there. Some of our graphic illustrations we're still working on, but we really look forward to your input. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ellis, and you can sort of finish this up here.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So like Anne said, we are taking your input now on the entirety of the guidelines. And so our current input period goes until May 14th. And after we receive input from you all, from the city staff, we will continue to incorporate that feedback while also refining it. So like Anne said, there's still some refinements to be made for the graphics, still some captions to add for all of the images. So we'll be continuing that process. In mid-June, so we're looking at June 14th is when we will submit our final draft to the city. And at that point, the city will take that draft through workshops with HARC and with city council, and then looking for the absolute final approval from city council in over the summer. And so in the meantime, we're taking any of the feedback to incorporate and our goal is really to make this a clear, user-friendly document. So feedback along those lines, how can this be easier to find? Things like that is going to be very useful for us, in addition to feedback on the guidelines themselves. And with that, I will stop sharing, and we can take any questions that have come up.
Thank y'all so much, Anne and Ellis. I really appreciate this presentation and all of the hard work that y'all have done to help us with this update. We did have a couple of questions come in, although this looks like it might be more questions for staff. So we had a first question for the urban commercial, and Anne, if you would kind of partner with me on this. For urban commercial, will businesses ever be required to install adequate parking, or will they always be grandfathered? And so staff's response on that is there's a couple of things at play here in terms of parking requirements. So they talked about Area 1, which is the courthouse square and the blocks immediately surrounding the courthouse. That doesn't have a parking minimum. And so most of those lots are completely taken up by buildings and very old buildings in a lot of cases. So you're not required to provide parking on the property for the 9 blocks of the courthouse square and its surroundings. Area 2 is a little different, the rest of the downtown, and that was highlighted in one of the maps that they showed. That's a map that we've got posted online, and something that'll also be in the design guidelines. Area 2 has a different parking ratio. You are required to provide parking, and the ratio is 1 space per 500 square feet of building area. Where that becomes difficult sometimes, especially when residential structures are converting to commercial, is fitting all of that on the site. Or what also happens is that if a site was developed prior to our parking requirements, which have only been adopted here in these last few years, then it may not have the same parking ratio that we have today. So what we do have is that any new development that comes in has got to meet the parking requirements. And there are a few different ways to do that. You can kind of do it according to how the code lays it out, or there are options in our Unified Development Code that lay out how you can apply for an alternative parking plan. And there are kind of a limited set of solutions available there. So anytime a new project is coming in, they talked about infill construction, those new buildings, they've got to go, whoever is developing that project has got to go through a technical review process for the site plan, and that's where the parking gets addressed. Parking doesn't get addressed as much through the certificate of appropriateness process. and the parking counts themselves don't get addressed in the certificate of appropriateness process. But Anne, could you perhaps kind of go back just a little bit for us and kind of share why we might want to have parking behind a building versus in front of it, and the difference that that can make in our historic districts?
Sure. One of the things that is a character defining feature is when houses or residences are setting back and they end up being in an urban area. If you start to pave those and have cars park in them, it completely changes the character of the neighborhood. What we would rather see as we look into the future, that the downtown district becomes a very walkable district. And we, in that setback, we actually allow for paving if you're going to put an outdoor cafe out there or do something else in that the setback area. It doesn't have to be all grass and trees and petunias. But we think that the idea of people walking around is really important. And what we're hoping in the future, as things change, is that parking is really controlled and regulated, and there's adequate parking through parking structures. And we actually have a section on what parking structures should be and look like. But I really don't think it's appropriate in a historic district. It's the first thing that happens, and I can show you lots of examples if that works, of just, if that would persuade you, of just when people take a house, make it into a business, and then pave the front yard and there's cars sitting there. That is, it's quite unattractive, and it not only affects that house, but it affects the character of the entire neighborhood. So we're trying to avoid that. You already have some pretty good parking regulations, so I don't think that we're being out of line with parking in that residential zone.
Thanks so much, Anne. So we had another question. We've had questions start to come in. So if you do have a question, you can use the Q&A function. There's a button for that in the Zoom. There's also a chat function. You can send a message to the panelists and we'll take questions that way. If you're on Facebook Live, you can write a comment or write your question into the comments so we can answer that. But our next question is, and this is probably for staff, are there new or updated descriptions of the low, medium, and high priority residences? So this is such a good question. If you're not familiar with it, in 1984, Georgetown had its first historic resource survey. And that was a survey done in partnership with a professional firm, as well as what's now Preservation Georgetown. And we identified all of the historic structures in the city at that time. But that was 1984, and so now we're in 2021, and we have to update that survey periodically, not only because the number of historic structures that we have might change. We might lose some historic structures, and we did lose a number of structures between the 1984 survey and the 2007 survey. But also, by the time we go from 1984, the first survey, to 2007, the second survey, to 2016, the third and most recent survey, buildings have aged during that period of time and may have become historic in that time period. That historic resource survey is a separate policy of the city, and it's a second, kind of a separate document and resource. And so the way that buildings get categorized is not according to our design guidelines, it's according to our historic resource survey. So if we were going to make any changes to that, that would be a process that we would have to go through separately. So the update to the design guidelines doesn't change how your home in the Old Town Overlay District is categorized. For example, we've got high, medium, and low. And the way that we apply the certificate of appropriateness process requirements sometimes depends on whether the house is a high, medium, or a low priority on that survey. So in the future, we'll need to update that to capture changes to our historic fabric. But in the meantime, this is not going to affect the high, medium, and low priorities. It's just going to affect the design review requirements if you're located in a historic district. But really, really good question there. Thank you for that. And this is a question for y'all. Historically, urban residential does not necessarily have gabled roofs like you described. Some do, some don't. And in fact, in our downtown, this commenter is speaking about Georgetown, we have some residential buildings that have flat roofs. So how would this be addressed in the design guidelines? Are you saying that we can't have flat roofs at all in area 2 or in this kind of urban residential context you described, or is there still an opportunity for those?
The way the design guidelines are written right now, the form would have to be, it would have to have, it doesn't have to have a front-facing gable, but it does have to have a sloped roof on it to make it more residential in scale. I was not aware that you had flat-roofed residential buildings besides multifamily buildings, which I think are much more sort of urban buildings. So, you know, we can take a look at that again, but the idea of residential commercial is to have buildings that fit more within a neighborhood that's both residential and urban. So, and I think you can do some contemporary buildings, but you know, you don't have to make you know, yield you know, cute replica historic buildings to be successful. But I do think that, and maybe that's something we need to add to the guidelines, is some contemporary buildings with sloped roofs. But I do think that sort of residential feel, sitting back away from the street, it will continue the character that exists right now.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. And that's something that as we kind of move forward through this process, that's exactly the kind of feedback that we're looking for, is feedback on the proposed changes so that we can have those great discussions and figure out what a great fit for Georgetown would be. We wanted to tailor these more specifically to Georgetown, and this is part of the way that we do that. So, Anne, we have another question, and I think this is kind of going back to this notion of transition zones and this urban and commercial and residential context. The question is, do the guidelines address the transition zones between urban commercial and residential and Old Town? Can a large, heavily used commercial building be built next to a single family house? You mentioned the looming issues between residential neighbors, but what about looming issues between commercial and single family homes? Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. We do have quite a bit of language about parking for the commercial buildings up against residential and how you block that. We have language in there about garbage containers that end up in the back of the building next to a residence. So we've addressed some of those things. We did not address looming standards in residential, and that might be something we need to look at. I think that's a good point, which is why it's good to have public meetings. I do think that's a really good point. So I'm going to make a note of that. In that sort of transition, if you're next to a residential structure, how that might work. So,
and then we have another question: how will the guidelines be enforced, or are they just guidelines? This is a really good question too. We appreciate not only everybody's time joining us for this open house, but the really good questions. And so the way the guidelines work, if you're not familiar with the process, or if you've maybe gone through the process once, we have 2 historic overlay districts in Georgetown. And as of last night's council meeting, we have our very first local historic landmark designation, which is almost like a little tiny historic district of its own. And so for the properties that are located within those historic overlay districts, for us, it's the downtown, the Old Town, and then also now this new landmark for the Johnson House. Those require a certificate of appropriateness. It's a special application that has a review process for changes to the exterior. If you're going to make changes to the interior of a property, a structure, whether it's historic or not, that just requires the applicable building permit. If you're going to make changes to the exterior of a building located in one of those historic overlay districts, then we look at whether or not it's part of the street-facing facade, We look at what the nature of those changes are. We look at whether it's a historic building or a non-historic building. And so in a few cases, no certificate of appropriateness is required. If you're doing maintenance that's kind of laid out in our code, there's no certificate of appropriateness required. There are a few things that we don't have the requirement for. But for the most part, exterior changes to structures, historic and non-historic, in our historic districts require a certificate of appropriateness. And when we look at whether or not the proposed changes help protect and retain our historic character, which Georgetown has said that we really value as a community, we use these design guidelines in that review process. So for example, if you wanted to put a new sign on your downtown business, and we have that quite frequently, we've got a really healthy, vibrant downtown. What we look at is, does the sign meet the size requirements that we've laid out? Does it meet the material requirements that we've laid out, the illumination style, et cetera? And so we look and see, does it meet all of those requirements? And if not, is there a good reason why it doesn't meet the requirement? So the design guidelines get applied in that design review process, and they are guidelines in that they give us good guidance, but we also take into consideration context factors. And so when we're talking about residential additions, it's not just the impact to the house itself, it's the impact to the surroundings. When we talk about new commercial buildings, we're not just looking at the design of the building itself, we're looking at the way that it relates to the surrounding properties. And so they're one of our most important tools for protecting the character of our historic districts, which Georgetown has said and continued to support. This is really important to us and our identity. And so that's why we have a special review process just for that. I'm not seeing any more questions yet. So if you do have any kind of last minute questions for this open house, please go ahead and put those in the chat or in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook Live, please put that in the comment section. But I did want to share kind of a little bit more about what comes next. So if you go to historic.georgetown.org, and for everybody who joined us live in the Zoom meeting, you've already been there to get the Zoom link. But the design guidelines update documents have been published. So they're live, they're there for you to click on and download. We would really love your input and feedback. So what we would ask you to do is to have a read through those. We have attached or linked the document that's the full update, all of the pieces. It's over 200 pages because there's some really gorgeous photos that help illustrate what we're talking about. Photos that are really focused on Georgetown and our historic districts. And then we've also broken it up into separate chapters. So if you're only interested in signs, for example, you can go straight to the chapter on signs, chapter 5, and see the content there. If you're only interested in Old Town, then there's chapter 3 for Old Town. You can go straight to it by clicking on it. If you would really like to explore the preface and the appendices, those are linked separately. And if you want the document as a whole, because you want to see the whole picture all at once, you can get that as well. So what we would ask you to do is to click on those links, access or download those documents, have a look, and then staff is going to be available over the next several weeks as we continue this process to meet with you, to speak with you, to answer questions, to give more information, to take your feedback. If you see something that you think works really well, we'd love to hear about it. If you see something that you don't think works as well, we'd also really like to hear about that. And so there's a few different ways that you can provide those comments to us. You can call us directly at 512-930-3581. That's the direct line for historic preservation. It's like the historic preservation hotline for the city of Georgetown. So you can call that number and talk to somebody, ask questions, look for more answers. If you need help navigating, want to know where to find something, we're glad to help with that. If you want to give feedback, if you want to schedule a meeting with us, we'd be glad to do that too. You can also email historic@georgetown.org. That's the historic preservation email address. And so historic@georgetown.org will go to planning staff and we'll be able to assist you. If you want us to email you a copy of the document, we can do that. If you need more information, if you want to mark the document up with your comments and send that to us, we'd be really glad for you to do that as well. And then if you're more comfortable with in-person, or it's important to you to meet with planning staff in person, you can absolutely do that. So we are located at 809 Martin Luther King Jr. Street. Our front door is right across the street from City Hall. And so if you want to walk in and ask to speak to a planner, you're welcome to. It might be easier if you call and make an appointment to make sure that somebody can meet with you very promptly. We want to be able to do that since we're having a virtual open house. Some of you who have been participating with us for a long time are used to maybe meeting at the library. And so we're still going to be available to you, still available to answer those questions, have that discussion. And we want to make sure that we do that. So if you want to call, if you want to email, or if you want to meet with us in person, we're really happy to do that with you and help through this process. And so we are looking to have comments back by May 14th so that we can keep this project moving along on a good timeline. The design guidelines, until they're adopted, will not change. So the current design guidelines that we have are what's going to stay in place unless and until council approves and adopts new guidelines. So if you're wondering about your project and what applies, there's no change to what applies right now. We're still using the design guidelines that we have for any projects that are coming in. And so what we are going to do, though, is go to City Council in their workshop on May 25th. That workshop will have a portion for public comment. So that would be a great time. You can watch on Zoom. You can also join in City Council Chambers Live if you'd like to do that. If you have any questions about that, please contact staff. And then as we move forward in the process, we're looking to start the adoption process in June, like Ella said. And the first step would be to bring the final draft before our Historic and Architectural Review Commission. One of their responsibilities is to make recommendations on things like design guidelines to the City Council. So we'll go to HARC with this first. That will be a public hearing. You'll have an opportunity to speak or make comments if you'd like. And then we'll have 2 City Council meetings on this. It is adopted via ordinance, so 2 City Council meetings are required, and we're looking forward to that probably in July. So if you need project information or just want to catch some updates, if you want to watch the open house from December, if you want to see the public engagement report from the first phase of our project, you can find all of that at historic.georgetown.org. There's a big blue button at the top you can click to go to the project page, or you can scroll down a little bit. Right on the front page is where we're putting the design guidelines, the proposed updates. And then as soon as we finish this meeting, we will pull down the recording, we'll get it posted, and you'll be able to watch a recording of this meeting. Share that with people who maybe weren't able to join us live. That way people can still get the same great information. So as we start to wrap up, we still have a couple of questions. And so what I want to kind of highlight is kind of the last question is the current guidelines use the following language on what the guidelines are, and will this language stay? And the language that we're pointing to is guideline. In this document, a guideline is a requirement that must be met when it is relevant to the project under consideration in order to be in compliance with the City of Georgetown's design review process. And then the word should, if the term should appears in a design guideline, then compliance is required. And so what we want to kind of come back to is these are project review requirements that are part of protecting our historic districts. And so they're one of the things that is considered. And so one of the things that we experience pretty frequently in historic districts is that buildings are not all the same and situations are not all the same. And for our historic buildings in particular, most of them were constructed before we had modern zoning rules and modern building codes. And so what we want to do is our absolute best to make sure we apply these standards that we've all agreed to. The last time that this document was updated was back in 2012. So we're almost 10 years past that now. And this is a great opportunity for us to kind of reconvene on making sure that the guidelines are something that works for our community, that's really well supported by our community. And so when we look at applying these design guidelines, we're looking to make sure very carefully that when we look at adopting this new set, this is something that our community can support. And so we want to make sure, importantly, that we're able to apply these successfully to the projects that come through the review process. And we want to make sure that these are design guidelines that work. So one of the best way that we can make sure that the design guidelines stay relevant and applicable to the projects that are requested is that we have our community supporting what we're adopting. And so if you have comments, if you have edits that you want to share with us, we're really looking forward to that. We're almost to time. We wanted to make sure we stayed within the hour window. So if you do have additional comments and follow-up, please contact staff. So I'll repeat the phone number in email. It's 512-930-3581. And you can also email historic@georgetown.org. And the design guidelines are posted on the website historic.georgetown.org. So you can go ahead and take a look. Tell us what you think. Ann and Ellis, thank you so much for joining us again. We really appreciate the hard work that y'all have done. And we're looking forward to working through this process with our community, making sure we capture those comments and capture that feedback and get us a document that is a really good reflection of how we can best protect Georgetown's very unique and very wonderful historic district. So do y'all have any closing comments before we sign off?
Ellis, I'm going to have to hand it over to you. The meeting.
Anne has some construction going on in our house. We really appreciate your time in reviewing the documents that we prepared and your feedback, and we're all ears for it. So we look forward to continuing our work on this.
Great. So y'all, please reach out to planning staff. We're really happy to support you in this process. This is going to go on for the next few weeks. And so please take good time to review and then come back to us. And please be assured also, this is just the beginning of the public feedback process. And we're really looking forward to what our community has to say. So thank you everybody so much for your time this afternoon.